Hello, humans of the Vector Hack Festival. My name is Paloma Kop. I'm a media artist, and I'm going to talk to you about some recent projects I've been working on. So thank you for coming to this, and thank you to the Vector Hack people for hosting this. So this festival is about vectors. Derek Holzer had a really simple description of what that means in the title of his book. He called it sound modulated light. So normally you're using an electronic signal to control a speaker and an oscilloscope or laser. So what you're hearing is also what you're seeing, and you probably know all about how that works from the other talks, or you're going to if you haven't yet. But if you just take the term sound modulated light by itself, I think that working with oscilloscope graphics is only a single example of this. So I want to open that up a little bit. So what I want to talk about might be a little bit of a tangent, but in a way, it's really interesting to talk about it in this context, because there are some interesting parallels, and also because working with signals and oscilloscopes was kind of the background I was coming from when I started getting into doing this work. So what I've been doing is I've been using electromagnets to control different materials and liquids. I used ferrofluid, which is a liquid with iron particles in it, so it responds to magnetism. And I also used water inside of a speaker cone, which is a technique called cymatics. So I want to start off talking about cymatics because that was the thing that I started off with. I had seen other people's projects with it online, but I really wanted to see it happening in person. So I started building my own setup for it. I just took this old guitar amp and remounted the speaker cone so that it would be flat to the table. And then I took a little dish and spray painted it black and glued it into the speaker cone. So I was using the speaker cone as a pre-made electromagnet. So instead of creating vibrations in the air, it's actually vibrating the water and creating waves on the water surface. I took my camera and mounted it pointing straight down at the water, and I used a fluorescent ring light as the light source. You can see there's a magnifying glass built into the light, but I actually ended up taking that out. But basically, the reflection of the light gets distorted when it bounces off the rippling water surface, and then that creates wave patterns you can see in my footage. So this is the full view of the setup. So you can see there's a preview monitor so I can see what's coming out of the camera, because it looks very different on the camera compared to my eyes, and it's also really small and a little hard to get a good view when the camera is in there. And this is one of the first test shots from when I set this up. It's just shot on my phone, and I was starting to mess around with different signals going into the speaker and what these patterns look like. So you can see that these patterns are moving really fast, but they're also kind of repeating. And if I scrub through the footage a little slower, you can see that there's a lot of interesting movement that kind of gets lost because it's way faster than the frame rate can capture. Okay, so this is a diagram that I drew of the entire setup, including the signal source, the section that is generating the sound. I was using a really simple patch in Max MSP. All it did was generate a sine wave, and allow me to control the amplitude and the frequency. So that sine wave is coming out of the computer's audio interface and getting amplified, and then that's what's driving the speaker here. So the controls are really simple, but it allowed me to go through different frequencies and really fine-tune the frequency and see what different patterns would come out based on that. And I found out that changing the amplitude of the wave by changing the volume of the audio signal had a really drastic effect on the patterns. So I knew that the frame rate of my camera was 30 frames a second, or 30 hertz. So I was experimenting with setting the frequency of the oscillator to 30 hertz because I wanted to sync up the video and the waves in the water in order to capture a smoother movement of the water. And it definitely looked smoother at 30 hertz, but it kind of looked like it was flickering back and forth between two different images every other frame. So then I started trying out multiples of the frame rate, 60 hertz, 120 hertz, and so on. And I found that 60 hertz was kind of the magic number. Any higher or lower and it didn't really work, but right at 60 hertz, the movement of the waves seemed to kind of lock in with the video rate, and the patterns became really smooth, almost like they're in slow motion. So let me show you the piece that came out of this. So I'm going to show the beginning of this and then skip forward a bit. The title of this piece is Decoherence. So the speaker is creating standing waves in the water. They're also called Faraday waves. And I read that these types of waves generally oscillate at half the driving frequency. So I kept the sine wave oscillator at 60 hertz for this entire recording. And half of 60 hertz is 30 hertz, which would explain why the waves sync up so well with the video frame rate. So over the course of this recording, I was very slowly bringing up the amplitude of the sine wave. So at a low amplitude, you get that smooth movement, and the pattern is also being created by the waves hitting the edges of the dish and bouncing back in, and they're interfering with the original waves. So even though it's a very simple signal, there's this complex emergent behavior that's coming out. So as I bring the amplitude up more and more, the pattern becomes more and more unstable until it basically just totally disappears. And I really like how this transition to complete randomness is so gradual. There's not really any single point where it's like, oh, it's gone. it just slowly morphs into noise. And now there are water droplets flying out of the water at the camera. So that's about the point where I'm like, okay, I should probably turn this back down. So one of the main ideas in my work has been trying to address this idea in people's minds that electronic space-time and material space-time are these two completely separate worlds. So on some level, people think that what happens on the computer or inside of any electronic device takes place in some kind of alternate reality, some virtual landscape that we can never physically interact with. And that makes it less significant than what happens in what they call real life. And I think that comes from some deep-seated bias, but my response to that has been to try to explore how I can show that the boundary between these two things is really quite blurry. And I think that cymatics is a very interesting example of this, because you have these electronic interfaces, and you're using electricity to move this physical object, and you're getting these mathematical waveform modulation patterns inside of a physical material. And then I'm able to capture this with a video camera, and I can shoot at any level of definition that I want to, because it's an analog medium, so there's no resolution, there are no pixels. And this is very similar to the process of rescanning an oscilloscope. I think that working with oscilloscopes and vectors is also another very interesting example of that blurry boundary, because you're using the same principle of the electromagnets to move something in physical space, but what you're moving is instead this beam of electrons, and then you're using a phosphorescent or fluorescent mineral to translate this into light. And these phosphors are also very interesting materials because they're allowing this beam to become visible, but they're also changing the way that the image persists in time. So in the case of rescanning a CRT oscilloscope with a video camera, or even taking photos of it as well, you're taking this continuous process and breaking it into these discrete snapshots in time. So you have the time base of the continuous waveform, which is the period of the wave cycle, and then you have the time base of the frame rate, and you can create a harmonic relationship between them. So they have this relationship in time. So when you're making a piece with these analog media, you can decide, I'm going to create this for human eyes, or you can decide to create it with the camera in mind. And you might make different decisions based on this. So you're working with the properties of the camera instead of against them. So now I want to talk about another project that I did, and this one also uses electromagnets, but this time they're modulating the ferrofluids, which are these liquids that respond to magnetism. This is a video of the ferrofluid reacting to a magnet I'm holding in my hand and moving around underneath it. So I wanted to build an array of electromagnets that I could use to send signals into and modulate this magnetic liquid while it's suspended inside this container of salt water. and to use simple modulations that would create interesting fluid dynamic interactions between the liquids to create patterns and capture that with a video camera to create another kind of liquid video synthesizer. So this project took a lot more steps and trial and error, and I had to experiment a lot to get something that would actually function in a way that I wanted it to, especially because I needed to use inexpensive consumer electronics. In the labs, they have like scientific linear power amplifiers that can amplify signals properly, which are outside the range of human hearing. Because I was working with mostly sub-audio frequencies, and I needed to amplify them before I sent them through the electromagnetic coils. But yeah, I was just using normal audio amplifiers, so they didn't really respond to my signals in a perfect linear way, but they were definitely doing something. They were able to create some kind of oscillating magnetic field. So I started off by making 4 of these electromagnetic coils using this copper wire, and I was winding them around a soft iron core. And I also prepared a rectangular glass bottle to hold the liquid and prepared a solution of saline with a few drops of ferrofluid inside. So this is a video of my initial tests when I put that together, making sure that everything will be able to work together. So I made this 3D illustration to show the arrangement I ended up using for the 4 electromagnetic coils. So there are 3 of them in this kind of pyramid on the outside, and 1 vertical one in the center. The little rectangle sitting at the very top of the pyramid is the container with the ferrofluid. And this larger cube that the coils are inside of is like a support that I built out of glass to hold everything together. And the bottom right is just a photo of the actual thing. So this white stuff is moldable thermoplastic that I used to hold the coils in place, which I realized later was not the best material to use. But anyway, the 3 coils on the outside are all controlled by signals from Macs inside the computer. And I was sending them each a sine wave that's 1/3 phase apart. So the idea is to have a kind of rotational movement of the magnetic field. And then there's this 4th coil in the middle, and I had that hooked up to a DC power supply. And I could adjust the power level on that manually. So that one was able to hold the blob of ferrofluid more or less in the center, or I could turn it down and the ferrofluid would get pulled out more towards the edges, towards the other magnets. So here's a drawing I made of the whole setup that I used to shoot with. You can see the computer that's generating the signals coming out of the audio interface into a pair of stereo amplifiers, and these are hooked up to the coils. And here is the DC power supply running that middle coil. The ferrofluid is sitting up here, and the top of this cube is white, so you can't see through it. And then I have my camera facing straight down with a macro lens, and my preview, and my lighting stuff. So for the video piece that I recorded with this, I was controlling the frequency and the volume of the sine waves in max, and I was controlling the DC magnet with the power supply. So there was a kind of mixture between automations and live performance of the parameters. And I was able to make a wave recording of those signals that were going out to the coils, which were mostly too low frequency to hear. So when I made the soundtrack for my piece, I used those as control signals for my oscillators and filters. So I just want to show some excerpts from this piece. So I'm going to start playing it and then jump forward a little. The title of this piece is Morphogenetic Fields. So there's a pretty wide variety of behavior that I was able to get out of this setup. And I still find it so strange how alive these creatures seem to be, and they seem to be expressing a whole range of emotions. So this was a lot of fun to record, but I also realized as I was doing it that these electromagnetic coils were starting to really heat up. So I was trying to put fans blowing on it to try to stop the thermoplastic that I used to mount everything from melting. And so luckily I was able to get a good take before the whole thing just fell apart. And that was this recording. So this was what it looked like after the plastic melted and all the coils just collapsed. So if I do this again, I will definitely not use this thermoplastic because it melts at a pretty low temperature. But yeah, it gave me just enough time to do some experimenting. So I'm very interested in the structure of magnetic fields in space. They have these beautiful forms, but of course you need some way of making them visible. So using the ferrofluid is one way to make them visible. And you could say that using CRT oscilloscopes is another way of making them visible. when you're using an oscilloscope, you're modulating these magnetic fields, and then the beam is just there to allow you to see them. So to me, that's really the heart of the process you're working with. It's a very three-dimensional process, even though it's then getting projected onto a two-dimensional surface. So if any of you are familiar with wobulators, the process for creating those is a bit similar. You can add your own electromagnetic coils to a CRT video monitor to add your own modulations to the beam that's already being modulated by the video raster. And I have seen people mostly using audio amplifiers to drive these signals as well. And they run into the same issues with the coils heating up too, or even catching on fire. And if you saw the screening today, or no, if you saw the screening on Friday, the first part of the piece that I showed in that was made using this wobulator at Signal Culture. Okay, that's what I have for today. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it, and I think there's going to be a Q&A now. Thank you.